समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
Let's talk about the Saudi UAE breakdown and its implications. On Tuesday, which was December 30th, the Middle East witnessed an unprecedented escalation of tensions. And this time it wasn't between traditional rivals such as Israel and Iran, but between two long-standing allies, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Saudi Arabia carried out airstrikes on the Yemeni port of Mukalla, claiming that two ships had unloaded more than 80 vehicles and containers filled with weapons and ammunition. According to the Saudi-led coalition spokesperson, the UAE had transferred vehicles, containers and Emirati personnel to the Al Rayyan base without notifying Riyadh. This incident triggered a rare, very public confrontation between the Gulf partners. After a day of escalating statements and diplomatic friction and management, the UAE announced that it will withdraw its counter-terrorism forces from Yemen, a dramatic move that underscores just how serious the situation had become. And this raises some crucial questions. What exactly were UAE forces doing in Yemen? Why did the situation reach this breaking point? And what deeper layers lie beneath this crisis? Let's break it down. So part one is about the background. Unless we know where things are coming from, we wouldn't know where they're going. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union shaped the Middle East's political and military landscape. Local actors mattered, but what happened in Yemen, Iraq, Syria, or North Africa was heavily influenced, sometimes even dictated, by either Washington or Moscow. The collapse of the Soviet Union created a more fluid environment. Over the last decades, regional powers, Iran, Israel, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates have become decisive shapers of regional conflict. What happens in the Middle East today is not imposed by distant superpowers or just the United States. It is crafted by the ambitions, insecurities, and rivalries of these states themselves. In this multipolar regional system, Saudi Arabia and the UAE have emerged as the closest strategic duo between 2017 and almost until 2020. Now, tensions did rise, but they were managed. However, by 2021, more cracks began to appear. And by 2025, their relationship faced an unprecedented rupture, fed by diverging political interests, some kind of personal mistrust, proxy conflicts, and competing visions for regional leadership. So this explainer today rebuilds the story from the ground up, the details, the history, the breaking points, and the explosive present moment. So let's come to part two. First, understand who's who. What are the power centers, and then what are the friction lines? So if you look at the Gulf architecture, it consists of the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, which has Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Oman. And the GCC was born to provide collective security and economic coordination. But in practice, Saudi Arabia has always been the dominant member due to its size and religious significance. UAE, especially under Abu Dhabi's leadership, has evolved into a hyper-assertive, globally networked state, punching far above its weight. Iraq and Yemen, while geographically in the same region, sit outside the GCC but are deeply affected by Gulf influence. But there are some other key players as well. Iran, a revolutionary power with networks of proxies across the region, and these networks of proxies, I'm sure you know, the Hezbollah, Hamas, and Houthis, seen significant decline after Assad's fall in Syria, Israel's wars, and the US backing to Israel. Then there is Turkey, ideologically driven under President Erdogan, but pursuing pragmatic influence across Syria after Assad's fall, also in Libya and the Horn of Africa, and with the GCC countries, especially the UAE. Then comes Israel, newly normalized with several Arab states under the Abraham Accords, expanding its footprint in the Gulf, significant rise in influence after Assad's fall, and also after Iran-Israel direct wars and Trump's backing. And the rise of Israel and Turkey and the relative decline of Iran have reshuffled regional alliances, creating overlaps and collision points between Saudi and Emirati agendas. And then comes the Muslim Brotherhood question, a starting point of alignment and later of divergence. So the Muslim Brotherhood, or the MB, is a transnational Sunni Islamist movement founded in 1928, which became a key force during the 2011 Arab Spring. Its ideology of political Islam threatened the hereditary monarchies of the Gulf. Qatar and Turkey became the Brotherhood's patrons, while Saudi Arabia and the UAE emerged as the leading anti-Brotherhood powers. But while they shared this objective, the UAE used the anti-Brotherhood banner to build its own sophisticated proxy network, projecting power into several regions. For example, Yemen, Libya, Horn of Africa, Egypt, Tunisia, and Sudan. For Abu Dhabi, crushing the Brotherhood was both ideological and instrumental. It provided a convenient justification for expanding Emirati influence even at the expense of Saudi interests at times. And this was one of the earliest seeds of strategic divergence. And then let's talk about the personalities. Who makes these choices? Now, when it comes to Saudi Arabia, it's King Salman, who's the official ruler since 2015, elderly, limited involvement today. But the more important player is Mohammed bin Salman, or MBS, who's the crown prince and the de facto ruler, who's ambitious, transformative, assertive, stylish. Now, coming to United Arab Emirates, or the UAE, it is a federation of 7 emirates: Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Sharjah, Ajman, Al Quwain, Fujairah, and Ras Al Khaimah. Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, or MBZ, who is the president of the UAE, ruler of Abu Dhabi, and supreme architect of Emirati foreign policy, is the key player. For years, MBZ acted as a political mentor to the younger MBS. But between 2019 and 2021, their relationship has somewhat started to deteriorate. Now let's come to the next part. What was the golden era of the Gulf couple? And this golden era was somewhere between 2017 and 2019. 2017 marked the strategic high point of Saudi-UAE relations. So, jointly speaking, they launched the Qatar blockade. They presented themselves as the United Arab Corps steering the regional order. They coordinated security policies with full backing from Trump 1.0 administration. They dominated GCC politics and intervened aggressively in Yemen. They also backed Haftar in Libya, centered themselves as the anti-Muslim Brotherhood and anti-Iran axis. And this period created an illusion of a permanent strategic alignment. But below the surface, contradictions were forming, and especially with regard to Yemen. So now let's take a look at where all these powers have been having these divergences. So part 4 is about the divergences, and we'll begin from Yemen. So the first real breach came with Yemen's civil war that began in 2014 when the Houthis captured Sana'a. In 2015, Saudi Arabia intervened militarily, joined by the UAE, framing the effort as a coalition to restore Yemen's legitimate government. But the reality was that UAEs also pursued a parallel agenda. While Saudi Arabia focused on defeating the Houthis and reinstalling the government, the UAE focused on southern Yemen, ports, and the Red Sea. UAE also supported and armed the Southern Transitional Council, or the STC. It also worked to shape a de facto southern authority in Yemen. It built a major airbase on Mayoun Island, controlling the Bab el-Mandeb, even though it has never been recognized officially by UAE. And it also installed a network of militias that became loyal to Abu Dhabi. And by doing all this, it somewhere undercut Saudi-aligned Yemeni factions whenever needed. UAE also avoided taking the main military and reputational burden of the war. Saudi Arabia fought the Houthis, but the UAE built a maritime empire. So this divergence became more visible slowly and took us to the flashpoint that we saw in 2025. So in late 2024 and early 2025, the STC, which is backed by UAE, expanded into Hadramaut and Mahara, which are Saudi red lines. A UAE weapons shipment arrived at Mukalla for separatist forces, and Saudi Arabia launched airstrikes on Mukalla. Riyadh called Emirati activities extremely dangerous. UAE denied and then announced a troop withdrawal, but left its proxies intact. So whatever they have announced by way of withdrawing is simply the official side. This was the most public Saudi-UAE direct confrontation in decades, signaling that the relationship has had some serious challenges. But what about divergences in other areas? For instance, let me come to OPEC Plus and oil politics. Oil politics too pushed tensions into the open. For example, in 2021, Saudi Arabia backed an OPEC Plus agreement on extending production cuts, but the UAE rejected the deal publicly, demanding a higher baseline. Negotiations stalled, the rift burst into global headlines. For Riyadh, this was a betrayal of Gulf unity, but for Abu Dhabi, it was a signal that it refused to be treated as a junior partner. Then again, there was more divergence seen in the case of Sudan, which is the most dangerous regional proxy war. The UAE's escalation in Yemen may partly reflect rising Saudi diplomatic pressure on Abu Dhabi over Sudan. And for that, we have to understand that Sudan's civil war between 2023 and 2025 has turned into a Saudi-UAE proxy confrontation. Saudi Arabia backs the SAF, which is led by Burhan. It has deep historical ties, then there is the Red Sea security priority, and fear of a militia-led Sudan. On the contrary, UAE backs the RSF. They do gold smuggling networks, they have long-standing ties, and they aim to shape Sudanese politics. And by that, the idea is to project influence across Africa. So UAE weapons reportedly flow to the RSF via Chad and Ethiopia. Chinese drones are also made available to Sudanese militias that in turn fight on the behalf of the Emiratis in Yemen as well. So Saudi Arabia is mobilizing Egyptian, Turkish, and Gulf support for the SAF. So this proxy war is now one of the main drivers of the Saudi-UAE breakdown. And all indicators suggest that every faction is preparing for another major round of fighting. There are increasing reports that the UAE is establishing another cross-border logistics point for the RSF inside Ethiopia, potentially involving weapons transfers. Meanwhile, Burhan has been meeting with his external supporters, Egypt, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia, to secure backing for the SAF ahead of the expected battle for central Sudan, which means that very soon the UAE and Saudi Arabia are going to be against each other in Sudan as well. So Yemen was just the starting point. Then there is divergence on the question of normalization with Israel. I'm sure you remember the Abraham Accords, where UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan established normalization with Israel. And this established a new geopolitical axis. However, Saudi Arabia chose to not join the UAE's normalization spree. On the contrary, the UAE's normalization with Israel strengthened its defense partnership with Israel, won favor in Washington, allowed it to access Israeli technology, defense technology, boosted Emirati intelligence capabilities, but it also created a new imbalance, which is that UAE and Israel formed a fast-growing security complex. Saudi Arabia was left negotiating from a slower, more cautious position. Israel's rise, combined with Turkey's growing assertiveness, forced Abu Dhabi to balance more carefully than Riyadh preferred. For the UAE, normalization was a strategic triumph. But for Saudi Arabia, it was a reminder that the UAE would not wait for Riyadh's lead. And then there's been divergence on economic competition, which means that this economic competition has turned the former allies into rivals. Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 transformed the economy and unintentionally, maybe, threatened UAE dominance. So Saudi policies forced companies to relocate regional headquarters to Riyadh, invested massively in logistics, tourism, sports, and finance, and challenged Dubai's role as the region's commercial hub. The UAE sees Saudi Arabia not as an economic partner, but as a rising competitor aiming to undercut Dubai's centrality. And now let's talk about the present moment, which is 2025-2026, when we have just seen the most serious rupture yet. So the Saudi-UAE conflict is multi-layered. Now, the first theater was, of course, Yemen, where we saw direct military confrontation between Saudi Arabia and UAE. The second is Sudan, where we saw Saudi Arabia and the UAE backing opposing factions in a devastating war. Then in OPEC Plus policies, where we saw public dispute over quotas and leadership, and then, that divergent approaches to reconciliation with Qatar, and new regional alignments and shifting power balances because of the rise of Israel and Turkey and what it means for the region. We also saw that there is economic rivalry between UAE and Saudi Arabia. And finally, the proxy webs, which means overlapping contradictory maneuvers carried out by a range of proxies, often with cross-cutting loyalties and interests. UAE's backing shows that it doesn't view a full-fledged disruption of ties with Saudi Arabia, for there are still several convergences. But in a region where Israel and Turkey have seen considerable enhancement of power and influence, and also their own competition, we will see more balancing and counterbalancing by regional powers. So to conclude, Israel's recognition of Somaliland, which has happened very recently, has further polarized regional politics, forcing African states and their partners to signal where they stand. The UAE and Ethiopia have notably avoided condemning the move. The decision has also energized states seeking to counter Ethiopia, Egypt, Djibouti, Eritrea, and Somalia, along with middle-order rivals to Emirati influence like Turkey and Saudi Arabia. The Houthis, for their part, have warned that any Israeli presence in Somaliland would constitute a legitimate military target. So the situation is going to get a lot worse before it comes back to anything that we can consider normal. And I'm going to be tracking that, so you stay tuned.